Everyone treats South Park like a joke with a middle finger attached. A cartoon for stoners and teenagers, nothing more. Something to laugh at, never something to trust. But looking at what the show actually got right, in order, across 5 presidents, tells a very different story. In this video, we break down how South Park has, over time, nailed American politics. The Douche and the Turd. 2004. South Park picked a school mascot election to make its sharpest point about American politics, using a giant douche and a turd sandwich to say something real about voting in the United States. The episode came out on October 27th, 2004, just days before Americans went to the polls to choose between George W. Bush and John Kerry. Trey Parker wrote and directed it, and it landed as the 8th episode of the show's 8th season, the 119th episode of the series overall. The timing was not an accident. South Park has always worked fast, often finishing an episode in less than a week, which let Parker and Stone react to real headlines almost as fast as the news came out. This time, they used that speed to release a message about elections right when the whole country was paying attention to one. This kind of fast turnaround was rare for television at the time, and it still is today. Most shows that use animation need months to finish a single episode, since drawing, coloring, and putting together every frame takes a long time no matter how skilled the team working on it happens to be. South Park worked differently from the beginning, relying on simpler cutout style animation and computer tools that let the team move much faster than most other shows on the air. Because of that speed, the show could react to something happening in the news on a Monday and have a full episode ready to air by that same week. This meant Parker and Stone were not stuck writing jokes about old news that had already faded from people's minds. They could respond almost in real time, and this episode is one of the clearest examples of that advantage being put to full use, since it landed right before the actual election, rather than weeks or months after the results were already known. The story starts small. PETA, the animal rights group, shows up to protest South Park Elementary using a cow as its mascot. The protest forces school leaders to hold a vote for a replacement. On paper, this sounds like a harmless school activity, the kind of low-stakes decision that happens in classrooms every year. But Parker and Stone use this tiny local election to build a much bigger point about how national elections actually work. The mascot vote becomes a stand-in for a presidential vote, and the joke grows out of how empty the choices end up being. The choice of a school mascot as the setup is worth noticing on its own, since it is about as low stakes as a decision can get. Nobody's life changes because of what animal or object represents a school sports team, and yet the show treats this meaningless decision with the same seriousness that adults bring to actual elections, complete with campaign speeches, arguments between classmates, and strong opinions about which option deserves support. By taking something so small and giving it the weight of a real political contest, the episode shows how much of political behavior comes from habit and tradition rather than the actual importance of what is being decided. People argue and take sides because that is what they have learned to do during any vote, not necessarily because the outcome matters as much as their behavior suggests. Kyle and Cartman get frustrated with the boring options the school offers, so they each put forward a joke candidate as a prank. Kyle suggests a giant douche. Cartman counters with a turd sandwich. Neither boy expects their joke to be taken seriously. Instead, these two ridiculous names end up as the only two real candidates left standing. The school population, all the students expected to vote, are stuck choosing between a hygiene product and a piece of food waste. There is no serious option left on the ballot. This is the entire premise, and it works precisely because it mirrors how many voters have felt about real elections. Watching two candidates they don't fully trust and having to pick one anyway. The fact that both joke names came from two separate boys, each trying to one-up the other with something more ridiculous, adds another layer worth pointing out. Kyle and Cartman are usually shown arguing with each other throughout the series, often over small disagreements that spiral into bigger fights. Here, their rivalry accidentally creates the entire election, since neither one wanted to be outdone by the other's joke. What began as two kids trying to embarrass their classmates turned into the only real choice on the ballot, almost by accident. This mirrors how some real political candidates rise to prominence less because of careful planning and more because of unexpected momentum that nobody fully controls once it starts. Stan Marsh becomes the center of the story once the joke candidates take over. Unlike most of the other kids, Stan refuses to accept that his only options are a douche or a turd. He does not think either choice deserves his vote, and he says so. This single decision, choosing not to participate in something he sees as pointless, turns him into a target. His refusal to vote is treated by nearly everyone around him as something close to betrayal. Adults in town act like Stan committed a crime just by staying out of the process. He gets threatened. He gets mocked. He eventually gets run out of South Park entirely, forced forced to leave on a horse while wearing a bucket over his head, a humiliating image that drives home how seriously his neighbors take his refusal to pick a side. The reaction from the adults in South Park is worth slowing down on, since it says a lot about how the show views peer pressure around voting. None of the grown-ups in town stop to consider that Stan might have a fair point about both choices being equally bad. Instead, they treat his refusal as unpatriotic, as though skipping a vote makes him a bad citizen no matter what the actual choices look like. This response escalates far beyond anything reasonable, moving quickly from disappointment to outright threats. A kid gets threatened with a weapon simply for saying he does not want to choose between two joke options, which stretches the situation to an extreme that highlights just how strange this kind of social pressure can look when placed under a harsh light. Real voters rarely face anything as dramatic as being run out of town, but many have felt a smaller version of this same pressure, a sense that not voting, or voting for neither major option, will be judged harshly by people around them no matter their actual reasoning. The insult that follows him is one of the most memorable lines the show has ever produced, delivered to explain why the choice always seems to come down to two bad options. The message is direct. Nearly every election, going back a long time, ends up between someone who acts like a douche and someone who acts like a turd, because those are the kinds of people willing to flatter and beg enough to make it that far in politics. It is blunt, it is crude, and it is also one of the most quoted pieces of political commentary the show has ever put into an episode, because so many people have felt exactly that way about their own choices at the ballot box. This particular line has taken on a life far beyond the episode itself. It gets repeated by fans, quoted in articles, and brought up casually in conversations whenever a new presidential race rolls around and neither major party candidate seems inspiring. Part of why this line has stuck around for so long comes down to how simply it explains a complicated feeling many people have but struggle to put into words. The idea that only a certain type of person is willing to go through everything it takes to win high office, and that this type of person might not always be the most trustworthy or likable, is something a lot of voters quietly believe but rarely hear said out loud in such a direct way. The show said it plainly, wrapped in a joke crude enough to make people laugh instead of feeling too heavy, and that combination is a big part of why the line outlived the episode's original release. While Stan struggles with his own refusal, the town moves forward with the vote. The election plays out just like a real one, with campaigning, arguments, and a real count at the end. Wendy, one of the sharper voices among the kids, raises an important point during all this campaigning, asking why a cow mascot would be considered offensive to animals, while a mascot based on a group of people would not carry the same kind of concern. Mr. Garrison brushes this question aside, explaining that PETA cares about the treatment of animals rather than the treatment of people, which is presented as a strange kind of logic that goes unquestioned by most of the adults around him. This small exchange adds another layer to the episode, showing that even inside a story about a joke election, the show found room to point out how selective some forms of activism can be, protecting one group's feelings while ignoring another's without anyone noticing the inconsistency. When the votes come in, the giant douche wins by a landslide, beating the turd sandwich by a wide margin, something like 1,400 votes to 36. It is not close. The overwhelming result makes the point even sharper, since it shows that even when people are given a joke choice, they will still show up, campaign, argue, and treat the outcome as something meaningful. Randy, Stan's father, tries to comfort his son by telling him that every vote counts, even the ones for a losing option, an argument many parents and civics teachers make in real life. It is meant to sound reassuring, but the show uses it almost as a punchline, because in this case, the argument feels hollow given how absurd the choices were to begin with. Even Stan, after everything he has gone through, ends up casting a vote near the end, choosing the turd sandwich rather than continuing to hold out. This detail matters because it shows even the character built around refusing to participate eventually gives in to the pressure surrounding him. His vote does not change the outcome in any meaningful way, since the giant douche wins by such a wide margin, but the act of finally voting shows how difficult it can be to hold a firm position once enough social pressure builds up around someone. Stan's resistance was strong throughout most of the episode, but by the end, even he folds, which says something honest about how hard it is to stand apart from a crowd for very long, even when someone believes they are right to do so. Just as the election wraps up, the story pulls a hard turn. Word comes in that the PETA members who started this whole mess have been murdered. According to the story, the killing happens because one member of the group throws blood on a celebrity guest appearing in the episode, and that celebrity responds by wiping out the entire group in retaliation. The school reacts to this news by reinstating the cow as the mascot, since the group that objected to it is no no longer around to complain. Stan's vote, which he was told mattered no matter what, suddenly means nothing at all, since the whole election gets wiped out by the news. Randy, who had just finished telling his son that every vote counts, has to explain that this time it actually did not matter. The joke lands because it takes a genuine piece of advice adults often give kids about civic duty and shows how quickly that advice can fall apart when circumstances change without warning. This ending twist deserves close attention because of how quickly it undoes everything the episode spent its whole runtime building. An entire election filled with campaigning, arguments, threats, and a landslide result gets erased by a single piece of unrelated news. The show seems to be making a point here about how fragile the outcome of any vote really is, since real-world events outside anyone's control can make an election result completely meaningless almost overnight. Randy's flip from insisting every vote matters to admitting this particular vote did not matter after all captures a kind of whiplash that mirrors how confusing and sudden real political outcomes can feel, especially when something unexpected happens right after people have already made their choice. Alongside all of this, the episode includes a strange subplot involving PETA members and animals that produces a half-human, half-animal creature, including one that appears to be part ostrich, a character disturbing enough that it begs to be put out of its misery during the episode. This subplot ties back to PETA's presence in the story and adds a layer of dark, strange humor that runs alongside the more grounded election plot. It is one of the stranger threads in the episode, blending body horror with the kind of over-the-top silliness the show has always leaned on, and it deepens the picture of PETA less as a serious activist group and more as a chaotic, almost dangerous presence lurking around the edges of the main election story. The episode closes with a parody song, styled after the kind of get-out-the-vote campaigns real networks run before elections, encouraging people to vote and treating the act of choosing as something almost sacred. Except here, the song is rewritten to be about choosing between a giant douche and a turd sandwich, turning a normally serious message into something absurd. The choice between two options that both feel worthless gets dressed up with the same kind of music and language usually reserved for real democratic participation, and the contrast between the seriousness of the music and the crudeness of the words is where a lot of the humor lives. The music used throughout the episode also plays a role in setting its tone, pairing upbeat, high-energy songs with the ridiculous events happening on screen. Using music that sounds celebratory and fun against the backdrop of a joke election, threats of violence, and a strange murder subplot creates a kind of mismatch that makes the whole episode feel even more absurd. This kind of contrast, serious-sounding music paired with silly or dark content, shows up throughout the show's history and is part of what gives South Park its particular style of humor, letting scenes feel both entertaining and unsettling at the same time. What makes this episode stand out, even decades later, is how often people bring it up whenever a new election rolls around and neither major candidate excites them. It became a shorthand phrase almost immediately. People say they are stuck choosing between a douche and a turd whenever they feel like their only options are two candidates they don't fully respect. This phrase has shown up again and again across many election cycles since 2004, used by voters who feel like nothing has really changed about how choices get presented to them. The episode's writers built something that stayed relevant well past its original release, since the core feeling it captured, being handed two bad choices and being told to pick one anyway, kept happening election after election. Some viewers over the years have pointed out that the episode does not pick a side. It does not favor Bush over Kerry, or one political party over another. Instead, it takes aim at the entire structure of choosing between only two options, no matter who those options happen to be. This kind of criticism, aimed at the process rather than any specific person, is part of why the episode has aged so well. Political jokes about specific people can lose their punch once that person leaves office or fades from public attention. A joke about the structure of choice itself does not expire the same way, since the structure tends to stay the same no matter who is running. This choice to avoid picking a side is one of the clearest examples of how Parker and Stone have described their own approach to satire over the years, treating every group and every side of an argument as fair territory for a joke, rather than protecting any particular position from criticism. By making both joke candidates equally ridiculous, neither one representing a clear winner or a clear loser in terms of decency, the episode avoids turning into a simple attack on one political party while praising the other. This balance is part of why so many different kinds of viewers across many different political beliefs have been able to watch this same episode and see their own frustrations reflected back at them, regardless of which candidate they may have personally supported back in 2004. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis process, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The PETA thread that kicks off this whole episode still has more buried in it than a simple protest over a cow mascot. There is a sharper point hiding underneath, one about how fast a genuine cause can turn into something absurd once small-town politics gets a hold of it. The next section pulls that thread apart and looks at what the show was really aiming at. Section 2. A cow, PETA, and the two-party trap. The whole chain of events in Douche and Turd starts with something that sounds almost too small to matter. PETA, the animal rights group, shows up in South Park to protest the use of a cow as South Park Elementary's mascot. On the surface, this looks like a footnote, a quick setup line meant only to get the plot moving toward the mascot election that becomes the real focus of the episode. But looking closer at how this protest unfolds and what happens because of it shows that the show packed a surprising amount of commentary into what looks like a throwaway beginning. PETA, in the real world, has spent decades building a reputation for using shocking, attention-grabbing methods to draw notice to animal welfare issues. The organization has run campaigns involving graphic imagery, provocative slogans, and public demonstrations designed less to persuade through calm argument and more to shock people into paying attention. Members of the group have thrown paint and other substances on people wearing fur coats as a form of public protest, turning ordinary moments like someone walking down a street into a confrontation meant to embarrass and provoke. This reputation for extreme tactics is well known and has followed the organization for a long time, showing up in news coverage, public debates, and plenty of parody across television and film. South Park draws directly from this reputation when it introduces PETA into the episode, using the group's real-world history of aggressive protest as the foundation for everything that follows in the story. The protest itself, aimed at a cow mascot, plays into a very specific kind of activism that focuses on symbols rather than direct changes to behavior or policy. A school mascot does not affect any actual cow. No animal is harmed, fed, or treated any differently because a school picked a cow as its symbol. The protest is entirely about representation, about what the symbol suggests to the public rather than any real-world consequence tied to it. This kind of activism, focused on symbols and representation rather than direct material impact, is common in real debates around mascots, especially in the years surrounding this episode's release, when many schools and professional sports teams faced pressure to drop mascots seen as offensive or outdated. South Park picked a topic that was already part of a larger national conversation and shrank it down to the smallest possible scale. A single elementary school choosing a new symbol for its sports teams in order to look at the underlying pattern without getting tangled up in any one specific real-world case. Wendy Testaberger is the character who pushes back hardest against the logic behind the protest, and her argument is one of the sharper moments buried inside this subplot. She points out that if using a cow as a mascot is considered offensive because it upsets animal rights supporters, then using a mascot based on a specific group of people, like a redskin or an Indian, an actual controversy that existed around real sports team names during this period, should raise the same kind of concern. This is a fair question, and it is one that plenty of real commentators have asked about the inconsistency in how different mascot controversies get treated. Some symbols draw huge public backlash and organize campaigns to remove them. Others barely register as controversial at all, even when they carry similar issues around representation and respect. Wendy asking this question inside a cartoon aimed mostly at making people laugh does not soften how legitimate the underlying point actually is. Mr. Garrison's response to Wendy is where the show delivers its real punch on this subplot. Rather than engaging with her question directly, he tells her that PETA cares about the treatment of animals, not the treatment of people, as though this fully explains and justifies the double standard she just raised. This response is presented without much pushback from other characters in the room, letting the strange logic sit there mostly unchallenged. The joke works because Garrison's answer sounds like it should be a real explanation, using calm, matter-of-fact language while actually avoiding the entire point Wendy raised. He answers a question about consistency by simply restating who the group in question happens to care about, without ever addressing whether that focus makes sense or whether it should carry more weight than concerns about how actual people are represented. This kind of exchange captures something real about how public debates often work outside of the show as well. Groups focused on one specific cause will sometimes treat that cause as the only lens worth applying, even in situations where a similar argument could easily be made about a different but related issue. A person or organization dedicated to animal welfare may not see any contradiction in ignoring concerns about how a mascot represents human beings, since animal welfare is simply not their their area of focus. From their perspective, this is not hypocrisy, just a difference in priority. But from the outside, especially to someone like Wendy who is looking at both situations side by side, the inconsistency can look glaring. South Park uses a short, simple exchange between two characters to hold up this pattern for examination without spelling out a clear verdict on which side is right. The episode does not resolve this argument in any neat way. Wendy raises her point, Garrison brushes past it, and the story moves forward without circling back to settle the disagreement. This lack of resolution is itself a kind of commentary. Real debates about symbols, mascots, and representation often play out exactly this way, with one side raising a fair point about inconsistency and the other side simply restating their own priorities without engaging with the challenge. Nobody wins the argument on screen because, in a sense, nobody wins this kind of argument in real public life either. Both sides walk away holding on to their original position, and the disagreement fades into the background as other events take over. Once the protest forces the school to hold an election for a new mascot, the story shifts almost entirely away from PETA and toward the students and their joke candidates. But PETA does not disappear from the plot completely. The group remains present in the background of the episode, and their presence takes an unexpected and much darker turn as the story continues. Part of this involves a stranger, more disturbing thread tied to PETA members and animals, one that produces a half-human, half-animal creature that appears at one point in the episode. Among these hybrid characters is one that appears to be part ostrich, a creature disturbing enough in its portrayal that it begs within the story to be shown mercy rather than left to suffer. This moment sits far outside anything resembling normal political commentary, leaning instead into the kind of shock humor and body horror that South Park has used throughout its history to unsettle viewers in ways that go beyond typical joke structure. This particular thread, involving PETA members and animals producing disturbing hybrid offspring, functions as an exaggeration of a common criticism aimed at animal rights activism. The idea that some supporters take their devotion to animal welfare to an extreme that starts to blur the line between caring for animals and treating animals as equal to humans in every sense, including intimate relationships. By pushing this idea to its most extreme and grotesque conclusion, the show is not making a careful argument about animal rights philosophy. It is instead using shock and disgust to mock a stereotype associated with extreme animal rights activism, exaggerating it so far past reality that the joke becomes almost separate from any real-world equivalent, existing purely as dark, uncomfortable comedy rather than pointed political critique. This is worth noting because it shows how South Park sometimes shifts away from sharp, focused satire and toward pure shock value within the same episode, even within the same subplot. The Wendy and Garrison exchange about mascots functions as genuine commentary, drawing a real parallel between two different controversies and letting the inconsistency speak for itself. The hybrid animal thread, by contrast, functions more as an extreme, exaggerated punchline, using discomfort rather than argument to get its laugh. Both threads come from the same starting point, the presence of PETA in South Park, but they pull in very different directions once the story develops them further, showing the range the show is willing to work across even inside a single subplot. The turning point for this entire thread comes when the story reveals that a celebrity guest appearing in the episode ends up killing the PETA members present in South Park, triggered by one member throwing blood on the celebrity as a form of protest, mirroring the real tactic PETA members have used against people wearing fur. This moment escalates the protest storyline from social commentary into sudden extreme violence, wiping out the group entirely. The reaction that follows from the school is immediate and almost bureaucratic in its coldness. With the protesting group no longer present to object, the school simply reinstates the cow as the mascot, undoing the entire election that had just taken place because of PETA's original protest. This ending detail deserves close attention because of how quickly it strips away the moral weight the protest carried at the start of the episode. PETA's objection to the cow mascot was treated, at least on the surface, as a legitimate concern worth the school's attention, serious enough to force an election and disrupt the normal running of the school. Once the protesting group is removed from the picture entirely, though, none of that original concern seems to matter anymore. The school does not weigh whether the cow mascot is actually offensive or inappropriate on its own merits. It simply reverts back to the original mascot because there is no longer anyone present to object. This suggests a harsh point buried underneath the joke, that some causes only get traction and attention because of pressure applied by a specific vocal group, and once that group is gone, whatever concern existed evaporates along with them, regardless of whether the underlying issue was ever actually resolved or even seriously considered. This mirrors a real pattern that shows up around plenty of public controversies, where an issue only stays in the spotlight as long as an organized vocal group keeps pushing it forward. Once that pressure fades, whether because the group loses interest, moves on to a different cause, or in this exaggerated case, is wiped out entirely, the original issue can quietly disappear from public conversation without ever being properly settled. South Park takes this pattern and pushes it to its most extreme, darkest possible conclusion, using violence rather than simple disinterest to remove the pressure group from the picture. But the underlying point about how quickly public attention can shift once the pressure behind an issue disappears still comes through clearly. Looking back at the entire arc of this subplot, from the initial protest to the final reinstatement of the cow mascot, a clear shape starts to emerge. The episode begins with something that looks like a genuine, if minor, cause: animal rights activists objecting to a symbol they find distasteful. It moves through a legitimate philosophical question raised by Wendy about consistency in which controversies get taken seriously. It detours into extreme, exaggerated shock comedy involving hybrid creatures and inappropriate relationships between activists and animals. And it ends with sudden violence that erases the protesting group entirely, followed by a return to the original status quo as though the protest never happened at all. This shape, moving from legitimate concern through extreme mockery and finally into complete erasure, captures something about how the show handles activism throughout much of its run, treating causes as worthy of examination while also being willing to exaggerate, mock, and ultimately dismiss the people behind those causes if it serves the joke. It is worth remembering that this entire chain of events exists inside the same episode built around the mascot election between the giant douche and the turd sandwich, the main plot most people remember when they think about this episode. The PETA subplot, small as it might seem next to Stan's refusal to vote and the landslide election that follows, sets the entire story in motion. Without PETA's protests, there is no mascot election at all. No joke candidates, no crude campaign slogans, and no moment where Stan gets threatened and exiled for refusing to choose between two ridiculous options. The show builds its sharpest political commentary about voting and elections on top of a foundation that starts with a much stranger, darker story about activism, symbols, and how quickly a cause can be dropped once the people behind it are removed from the picture. This layering, a serious commentary on democracy and voting built on top of a much stranger, more chaotic story about activism and its consequences, reflects something true about how South Park constructs many of its episodes. Rarely does the show pick a single target and stay locked onto it from beginning to end. Instead, episodes tend to move through multiple ideas, sometimes loosely connected, sometimes almost accidental in how they link together, letting one small setup detail, like a protest over a cow mascot, spiral outward into an entirely different, much larger conversation about elections and civic duty. The PETA subplot could have been left out entirely, replaced with almost any other excuse for the school needing a new mascot, and the core election story would still function on its own. But the choice to use PETA specifically, with all its real-world baggage around aggressive activism and provocative tactics, adds a layer of commentary that would not exist with a more neutral setup. Looking at the episode as a whole, it becomes clear that the writers were not simply interested in mocking one specific political party or one specific candidate ahead of the 2004 election. They were interested in a wider target, the machinery surrounding public decision-making itself, whether that machinery involves choosing a president or choosing a school mascot. Activist pressure, public votes, symbolic gestures, and the fragile nature of causes that depend entirely on continued attention all get folded into a single story, using humor that ranges from sharp and pointed, as seen in the Wendy and Garrison exchange, to extreme and grotesque, as seen in the hybrid creature material, to suddenly and shockingly violent, as seen in the deaths of the PETA members themselves. The PETA thread, small as it is compared to the election plot that follows it, ends up carrying a surprising amount of the episode's underlying argument about how public pressure works, how causes rise and fall, and how quickly attention can shift once the group applying pressure disappears from the picture. It sets up a pattern that plays out again in the main mascot election, where votes are cast, arguments are made, and outcomes are treated as meaningful, right up until unrelated news, PETA's sudden destruction, comes along and renders the entire process pointless. The same lesson about the fragile, easily undone nature of public decisions runs through both halves of this episode, tying the smaller PETA subplot directly to the larger and more famous election story that follows it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves away from this one episode entirely and looks at how South Park handled a completely different kind of political topic topic just a few years later, when the show turned its attention toward immigration using time travel and a parody of a well-known science fiction franchise as its setup. Section 3. Immigration through a time portal. Goobacks, 2004. Season 8 of South Park took a topic usually reserved for serious news debates and turned it into a story about time travel, borrowing the visual style of science fiction to make its point about immigration and labor. The episode is called Goobacks, and it aired on April 28, 2004, as the 7th episode of the 8th season and the 118th episode of the series overall. Trey Parker wrote and directed it, continuing the pattern of fast turnaround and direct engagement with real-world issues that defined much of the show's output that year. Where Douche and Turd tackled the structure of elections, this episode aimed at a completely different subject: the argument over immigrant labor and the wages tied to it, using a science fiction premise instead of a school vote to make its case. The setup begins with something strange happening early one morning in South Park. A mysterious figure appears out of nowhere, looking unlike anyone from the town, covered in a strange purple substance and clearly disoriented by his surroundings. Before anyone can figure out what is going on, he gets hit by a car, which is the first sign that something unusual has entered the town. This is how the episode introduces its central idea: a man arriving from somewhere far outside normal experience, confused, out of place, and immediately caught up in an accident simply because he does not understand how the world around him works. It turns out this man, and the many others who soon follow him, are not aliens or monsters despite how strange they look. They are ordinary human beings, just from a much later point in time, specifically from the year 3045, a future so far ahead that almost nothing about it resembles the world these South Park characters know. According to the story, this future has become a place of severe poverty and overcrowding, a world so bad that people living there are desperate to find any kind of work, any way to improve their situation, even if that means traveling backward through time to do it. A newly discovered time portal allows them to travel back to the present day, arriving in South Park covered in a strange purple residue that comes from the time travel process itself. This purple substance becomes the reason these visitors quickly earn a crude nickname from the people of South Park. Because of the goo covering their bodies when they first arrive, the townspeople start calling them goobacks, a term that blends the description of their appearance with the fact that they have traveled backward in time. The word itself carries an obvious echo of a real-world slur that has been used against certain immigrant groups, a connection that would not be lost on anyone paying attention to the news at the time this episode aired. By inventing a fictional slur tied to time travel goo rather than using an actual ethnic slur, the show manages to capture the ugliness of this kind of language, the way people invent insulting nicknames for groups they see as outsiders, without needing to use any real-world term aimed at an actual ethnic group. The fictional slur does the same job a real one might, showing how quickly a physical trait tied to a group of newcomers gets turned into a mocking label, but it does so using a made-up detail specific to this story, rather than borrowing directly from real-world prejudice. Once one person arrives from the future, more and more start showing up through the same portal, and it quickly becomes clear why they are all coming. Life in their time is so difficult, jobs so scarce, and conditions so harsh that even small amounts of money in the present day represent an enormous opportunity for them. These future visitors are willing to work for extremely low pay, amounts that would barely register as meaningful income for most people currently living in South Park. The reasoning behind this becomes clear as the episode continues. Because of how time works in the story, any money the future visitors earn and deposit into a bank account will sit there for over 1,000 years, collecting interest that whole time. Even a tiny amount of money today, once left untouched for 1,000 years of compounding growth, would eventually become an enormous fortune once these individuals return to their own time far in the future. This detail gives their willingness to accept incredibly low wages a logical explanation within the story, rather than presenting it as something illogical or purely comedic. From the perspective of the future visitors, working for what looks like almost nothing today is actually a smart long-term investment, one that will pay off massively once enough time has passed. This economic logic becomes the engine driving the rest of the episode's plot. Local residents in South Park quickly find themselves losing work because the visitors from the future are willing to do the same jobs for a fraction of the normal pay. The boys of South Park experience this firsthand. Early in the episode, they try to earn some spending money by offering to shovel snow off a woman's driveway, a simple job that would normally earn them a reasonable amount for their effort. Cartman, true to his usual character, tries to negotiate an outrageous price for this simple task, starting with a demand far higher than anyone would reasonably pay for shoveling a driveway. When the woman offers a much more realistic amount, amount, Cartman pushes back and manages to talk her up slightly from her original offer. This scene, while mostly comedic and built around Cartman's usual greed, sets up the contrast that becomes important once the future visitors start taking over these same kinds of small, simple jobs. Where the boys tried to negotiate for a fair, if inflated, price for their labor, the future visitors are willing to do the exact same kind of work for pennies, since even a tiny amount of present-day money represents a fortune once compounded over 1,000 years. The Marsh family becomes directly connected to this situation once Randy and Sharon hire one of the future visitors as a housekeeper, paying an extremely small hourly wage for the work. This detail places the story's central conflict directly inside the show's most familiar family, rather than keeping it at a distance through strangers or side characters. Stan, upset by what he sees happening around town, becomes the character most vocal about opposing the arrival of these future workers. He attends a public rally organized to protest their presence, joining a growing group of South Park residents who feel that their jobs and their community are being threatened by all these new arrivals willing to work for wages nobody from the present day could reasonably accept. When Stan uses the term goobacks in front of his parents to describe these workers, both Randy and Sharon react with shock and disappointment, treating the term as offensive and inappropriate, even though plenty of other adults in town are using the exact same word without any apparent hesitation. Randy's reaction to his son deserves close attention because of how his position shifts as the episode continues. Early on, Randy lectures Stan about the unfairness of judging these workers, explaining that the future visitors are only taking small, low-paying jobs that nobody else particularly wants to do anyway. He argues that it is wrong to look down on people who are simply trying to escape terrible conditions back in their own time, urging Stan to have more sympathy for their situation rather than treating them as some kind of threat. This argument mirrors a common position taken by real-world defenders of immigrant labor, the idea that immigrant workers are filling gaps in the labor market that local residents are unwilling or uninterested in filling themselves, rather than stealing opportunities away from people who actually wanted those jobs in the first place. This position does not hold up for very long once the situation becomes personal for Randy himself. Once Randy loses his own job to one of the future workers, someone willing to do his exact role for a fraction of his usual salary, his attitude flips almost immediately. Suddenly, Randy becomes one of the loudest voices among the group of residents opposing the future visitors, essentially becoming a leading figure among the very people he had been lecturing his son about treating unfairly just a short time earlier. This sudden reversal captures a sharp point about how easily people's principles can shift once an issue moves from something abstract and distant into something that directly affects their own income and livelihood. It is far easier to argue for sympathy and understanding toward a group of struggling workers when their presence has no real cost to your own life. Once that cost becomes personal, once it is your own job on the line, that same sympathy can disappear remarkably fast, replaced by the same frustration and anger Randy had been criticizing in others just scenes earlier. The show does not let Randy's hypocrisy pass without comment either. His flip from lecturing his son about compassion to becoming a leading voice against the future workers once his own paycheck is affected is presented clearly enough that viewers are meant to notice the contradiction themselves. Nobody in the episode needs to point out how quickly Randy's position changed, since the shift itself, shown plainly through his actions, does all the necessary work. This kind of storytelling, letting a character's own behavior expose a contradiction without needing extra dialogue to explain it, is something the show has relied on across many different episodes, and it works particularly well here because Randy's reversal happens so quickly and so completely. As tensions rise in town, a public meeting gets called specifically to address the growing anger over the future visitors and the jobs they continue to take. A resident named Daryl Weathers organizes this meeting, treating the arrival of these workers as a serious problem, requiring immediate action from the whole community. This meeting mirrors the kind of town hall gatherings that often happen in real communities dealing with concerns about immigration and labor competition, giving residents a chance to voice frustration and search for some kind of solution to the problem. The reasoning laid out at this meeting focuses heavily on jobs and wages, framing the future visitors primarily as an economic threat rather than approaching the issue from any other angle. This focus keeps the episode's central argument narrow and specific, tied directly to labor and pay rather than expanding outward into broader cultural or social arguments that often get attached to real immigration debates. One especially direct piece of dialogue in the episode lays out the frustration many of the townspeople feel, pointing out that despite accusations of prejudice, the plain fact remains that these future workers are taking jobs away from local residents, and unlike the residents, the future workers have the option of returning to their own time once they've made their fortune, leaving the present-day community to deal with the lasting effects of lost employment. This argument captures a real tension present in actual debates about immigrant labor. The idea that economic competition can be a legitimate concern separate from any question of prejudice or bias, even when accusations of bigotry get thrown around during these kinds of disputes. The episode does not pretend this argument is simply a cover for hatred, presenting it instead as a genuinely difficult economic problem tangled up with real consequences for people trying to make a living. Eventually, the story shifts toward a possible solution, one that comes from an unexpected source. Stan, working through the situation, arrives at a realization about why these future visitors keep showing up in such overwhelming numbers. He recognizes that the future they come from is poor and overcrowded specifically because of choices made by people living in the present. Choices about how resources get used, how the environment gets treated, and how wealth gets shared. If the present-day residents of South Park want the flow of future workers to stop, Stan reasons, the real solution is not to keep fighting against the workers themselves, but to work on improving conditions in the future by changing behavior right now, in the present day. This idea catches on quickly across the whole town. Residents begin taking action aimed at improving future conditions, starting new recycling programs, installing solar panels and wind-powered devices, planting trees, and giving more generously to people in need, all set to an upbeat, sincere-sounding song about building a better future. This entire sequence plays completely straight, without any obvious mockery, presenting environmental responsibility and charitable giving as genuinely positive actions worth taking. As these changes spread through the town, the future workers slowly begin to fade away, their need to travel back in time disappearing as conditions in their own era start to improve because of the choices being made in the present. This resolution offers a strikingly different kind of political point compared to Douche and Turd. Rather than settling on cynicism about the futility of civic participation, this episode suggests that collective, positive action, focused on the environment and generosity rather than politics or protest, actually solves the underlying problem driving the conflict. Where the election episode ended with news that erased the meaning behind an entire vote, this episode ends with a solution that actually works, showing residents making real changes and seeing those changes pay off by resolving the very crisis that had divided the town in the first place. The episode does not end on this purely wholesome note, however. Once the future workers have faded away and the immediate crisis appears to be resolved, the boys and the other men involved in this solution find themselves back in an earlier activity from before the future workers ever arrived, one involving a large group of men engaging in an intimate group activity together, something the episode had shown earlier as an ordinary part of these particular characters' routine. As they realized the work of recycling and environmental cleanup they had just been doing felt even less appealing to them than that earlier activity, Stan stops and admits with obvious discomfort that participating in this environmental effort felt worse to him than the group activity had. Kyle agrees, and Cartman goes even further, declaring the environmental work even less appealing than the group activity in question. Stan apologizes for pushing everyone toward this environmental effort, and the group happily returns to their earlier activity instead. This closing beat undercuts the sincerity of the environmental solution just presented, turning what looked like a heartfelt, straightforward message about collective responsibility into one final punchline. The show seems to be poking fun at its own moral resolution here, suggesting that even a solution that objectively works can still feel unpleasant enough to the people carrying it out that they would rather return to something else entirely, no matter how questionable that something else might be. This kind of ending, undercutting a seemingly sincere message with an absurd final joke, shows up frequently throughout the show's history, reflecting a reluctance to let any single episode settle into pure, uncomplicated sincerity without some kind of twist to keep things from feeling too neat. Looking at Goobax as a whole, the episode manages to tackle a genuinely difficult economic argument, the effect of low-wage immigrant labor on local workers, without resorting to simple, one-sided answers. The future workers are never portrayed as villains, since their motivations, escaping desperate poverty and searching for any opportunity to improve their situation, are treated with real sympathy throughout the episode. At the same time, the frustration felt by local residents losing their jobs is not dismissed either, presented instead as a legitimate concern tied to real economic pressure rather than pure prejudice. Randy's personal reversal captures how quickly abstract sympathy can crumble once an issue becomes personal, while the eventual solution, focused on improving conditions rather than simply blocking the workers from arriving, offers a genuinely different kind of ending compared to most of the show's political stories, one built built around actual problem solving rather than pure cynicism. The choice to set this story in a science fiction frame, using time travel instead of a real-world border, allowed Parker and Stone to explore an emotionally charged topic while keeping some distance from any specific country, ethnic group, or real-world policy debate. The future visitors are simply humans from later in time, not representatives of any particular nationality, which lets the episode focus purely on the economic and emotional core of the immigration debate without getting tangled up in issues specific to any one real-world group of immigrants. This approach mirrors how the show has occasionally used fantastical premises to explore heavy topics from a slight distance. Something worth keeping in mind moving into a very different episode, one that takes on an entirely different subject, using a religious organization as its target rather than a labor debate wrapped in science fiction. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section shifts away from economic conflict entirely and looks at how the show approached an organized religious group just 1 year later, when a personality test turns Stan into a messiah figure and a famous actor refuses to leave a closet. Section 4, The Closet Door That Wouldn't Open, Scientology, 2005. South Park spent an entire episode taking apart one of the most secretive organizations in America, using a school personality test and a locked closet door to do it. The episode is called Trapped in the Closet, and it aired on November 16th, 2005, as the 12th episode of the show's 9th season. It stands as one of the most talked about episodes the show has ever produced, not just because of what happened on screen, but because of what happened afterward. Behind the scenes, once real people connected to the show reacted to what they had just watched. The story begins with something small and ordinary. Stan, always looking for a way to save money, decides to take a free personality test being offered around town, a test connected to the Church of Scientology. This kind of free test was a real recruitment method the church used for years, offering a simple questionnaire to the public as a way to identify people who might be interested in learning more about the organization. Stan takes the test mostly because it costs nothing, not because he has any real interest in the church itself. His results, however, turn out to be unlike anything the church has ever recorded before. According to the story, his numbers are so extreme that he matches only one other person in the church's entire history, a man named L. Ron Hubbard, the real-life founder of Scientology who had passed away years earlier. This result sets off an enormous reaction within the church. Rather than treating Stan as just another new member, the leaders of the organization become convinced that he is the actual reincarnation of Hubbard himself, returned to lead the church into its next chapter. This belief spreads quickly among high-ranking members, and soon a large crowd of Scientologists begins gathering outside the Marsh family home, eager to meet the boy they believe is their founder returned to life. Among this crowd are two of the most famous real-world Scientologists at the time, John Travolta and Tom Cruise, both actors who had spoken publicly for years about their involvement with the church. Their inclusion in the episode was not some random choice by the writers. Both men were widely known, well before this episode aired, as prominent visible members of Scientology, making them obvious choices for a story built entirely around exposing the church's inner workings. Randy, overwhelmed by the crowd forming outside his house, sends Stan up to his room rather than letting him deal with the growing chaos downstairs. It is there, alone in his bedroom, that Stan meets Tom Cruise for the first time in the episode. Cruise, believing he is speaking with the reincarnated founder of his faith, eagerly asks Stan what he thinks of his acting career, clearly hoping for some kind of validation from someone he views as a spiritual authority. Stan, being an honest kid with no particular interest in flattering a grown adult, responds simply that Cruise is fine, but not especially impressive, comparing him unfavorably to an actor from a much smaller, less famous film. This blunt, harmless opinion sends Cruise into a complete breakdown. Rather than accepting the criticism or brushing it off, he locks himself inside Stan's closet and refuses to come out, an act so central to the episode that it gave the whole story its title. What follows is one of the strangest sequences of escalation the show has ever built. Randy tries to talk Cruise into leaving the closet, with no success. The real-life actress Nicole Kidman, Cruise's former spouse, gets brought into the story as another attempt to coax him out, and she fails just as completely. Rather than convincing Cruise to leave, more people end up joining him inside the closet instead. John Travolta enters to try his own approach, and rather than getting Cruise to come out, he ends up locking himself inside as well, refusing to leave alongside Cruise. This pattern repeats itself once again with the musician R. Kelly, who becomes involved in the story for reasons tied to his own well-known song from years earlier that shares its title with this same episode. Kelly enters hoping to to succeed where everyone else failed, and instead becomes the third person to lock himself inside the same closet, refusing to leave just like the two men already in there with him. This repeated pattern, person after person going in to help and instead choosing to stay, builds one of the episode's most memorable running jokes. A line repeated by Stan, directed at his father, expressing frustration and confusion that Tom Cruise simply will not come out of the closet. This phrase became one of the most quoted lines to come out of the entire series, repeated by fans and referenced across pop culture for years after the episode first aired, largely because of how directly it played with the real-world rumors and jokes that had already surrounded Cruise and Travolta's sexuality for years before this episode existed. The show never states outright what is actually happening behind that closet door. It lets the repeated refusal to leave, combined with the audience's own awareness of years of tabloid speculation about these two actors, do all the work of suggesting what the joke is really about without ever needing to spell it out directly. While all of this chaos plays out upstairs, something far more serious happens downstairs in the story. The head of the Church of Scientology, present among the crowd gathered at the Marsh House, begins explaining the actual beliefs and practices of the religion directly to Stan, treating him as the returned founder who deserves to know everything about the organization he supposedly built. This section of the episode moves away from comedy for long stretches, instead laying out real information about Scientology's origins, its structure, and its core teachings, presented in a surprisingly accurate and detailed way for a show usually built around exaggeration and parody. A journalist who had spent years investigating and writing about Scientology, including a book focused specifically on the subject, worked as a consultant on this episode, helping ensure the details being presented matched what was actually known about the organization's actual teachings at the time. This mattered a great deal in 2005, since Scientology's specific beliefs were still largely unknown to the general public, closely guarded by the organization and rarely discussed in this much detail on mainstream television. By presenting these details plainly, without adding exaggeration or obvious jokes layered on top, the episode let the actual content of the church's teachings create its own sense of absurdity. Rather than inventing an exaggerated, clearly fictional religion to mock, the show simply explained, as accurately as it could based on available research, what Scientology's leaders themselves taught to their most devoted members, trusting that hearing these ideas laid out clearly would be enough to make its point without needing extra jokes layered on top. Stan, hearing all of this information for the first time, eventually challenges the church's leader directly, questioning why members are required to pay increasing amounts of money as they move further into the organization's teachings. The leader's response to this challenge is unusually direct for a show that often relies on exaggeration, essentially admitting outright that this financial structure is exactly the point, scolding Stan for having fallen for something the church's own leadership apparently understands to be a scheme designed to extract money from its followers. The episode closes with Stan, having grown tired of the chaos surrounding him and unconvinced by anything he has heard, standing before the gathered crowd of Scientologists and challenging the entire organization to take legal action against him if they are so certain that suing people who criticize the church is truly justified, essentially daring them to prove that their reputation for aggressive legal responses to criticism is deserved. This closing moment ties together the episode's larger point about how the organization has historically responded to public criticism, often through legal pressure and lawsuits, rather than open debate about its actual teachings and practices. The reaction to this episode after it aired became just as significant as anything shown within the episode itself. The Church of Scientology was widely known, even before this episode existed, for responding aggressively to public criticism, frequently pursuing legal action against journalists, former members, and media organizations that challenged the church's practices. This reputation created real tension around the production and release of Trapped in the Closet, tension serious enough that the people working on the episode took an unusual precaution. When the episode's credits rolled, every single name connected to the production, including the show's own creators, appeared not under their real identities, but under the same fake name, listed simply and identically across the entire crew list. This decision reflected genuine concern that individuals involved in making the episode could become personal targets once the church saw how directly its teachings had been laid out on national television. The most serious consequence connected to this episode involved Isaac Hayes, the musician who had voiced the character Chef since the show's earliest seasons, and had become one of its most beloved recurring performers. Hayes was a practicing Scientologist in real life, a fact that had been known publicly for years before this episode existed. Despite this connection, Hayes had never previously objected to any of the show's other targets, sitting through through years of episodes that mocked Mormons, various world religions, disabled individuals, and countless other groups without any public complaint. Once this particular episode aired, focused specifically on his own faith, the situation changed. Several months after Trapped in the Closet first aired, a public statement was released in Hayes' name announcing his departure from the show, citing concerns about how the show handled religion in general. This departure, however, became the subject of significant controversy in the years that followed. After Hayes passed away, his own son spoke publicly about the circumstances surrounding this statement, explaining that his father had suffered a stroke around this same time, a medical event serious enough that his son believed Hayes was not in any condition to have written or approved such a detailed public statement on his own. Matt Stone, one of the show's creators, later said publicly that based on his own conversations with Hayes, it seemed clear that pressure had come from people connected to the church, rather than reflecting Hayes' own independent decision to leave. The suggestion made by multiple people connected to this situation is that individuals close to Hayes, themselves also Scientologists, may have released this statement using his name without his full understanding or consent, given his declining health at the time. Whatever the exact truth behind Hayes' departure, the show did not simply let the character of Chef quietly disappear without acknowledgement. In the following season, the show gave Chef a final storyline, built using older audio recordings of Hayes' voice from earlier episodes, pieced together to create one last appearance for the character before writing him out of the series entirely. This approach let the show handle a real, complicated situation involving a departing cast member, while still finding a way to use existing material respectfully, rather than simply recasting the role or dropping the character without any explanation at all. Separate from the situation with Hayes, additional controversy surrounded the episode when Comedy Central initially chose to postpone a planned rerun of Trapped in the Closet during a scheduled Scientology-themed marathon weekend, replacing it at the last minute with a different episode instead. Reports at the time suggested this decision may have been connected to concerns raised by Tom Cruise himself, tied to his promotional obligations for a major film releasing around this same period, a film produced by Paramount Pictures, a studio owned by the same parent company that also owned Comedy Central. Cruise and people representing him publicly denied any connection between his concerns and the network's decision to postpone the rerun, and the exact reasoning behind Comedy Central's choice has never been confirmed with full certainty. Despite all of this controversy, or perhaps partly because of it, Trapped in the Closet became one of the most celebrated episodes in the show's entire history. It received a nomination for a major television award the year following its release, recognition for how effectively it blended genuine information about a notoriously secretive organization with the show's usual style of comedy and exaggeration. The episode demonstrated a different kind of political and social commentary compared to earlier examples covered so far. Rather than focusing on elections, voting, or labor economics, this episode aimed directly at a private organization with enormous cultural influence and a well-documented history of aggressive responses to public criticism, using accurate information rather than pure invention as its primary weapon. The episode also captured something specific about how difficult it can be for a television show to criticize powerful institutions connected to its own industry. Both Cruise and Hayes were connected in different ways to the same broader entertainment business that produced South Park itself, and the fallout from this single episode showed just how complicated those connections could become once a show decided to aim its satire directly at a group with real influence over the people working alongside it. Losing a beloved cast member, facing possible legal pressure, and dealing with a delayed rerun all stemmed from a single 22-minute episode, showing just how seriously this particular target took any public criticism aimed in its direction. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves the story forward to a very different kind of political moment, one built around a real presidential election rather than a religious controversy, when the show managed to release a full episode about the outcome of the 2008 race just one single day after the actual votes had been counted. Section 5. Guessing the election a day early. About last night, 2008. South Park managed something almost impossible on November 5th, 2008, releasing a full episode about the results of the presidential election less than 24 hours after the country actually found out who won. The episode is called About Last Night, and it aired as the 12th episode of the show's 12th season, the 179th episode of the series overall. This was the second time the show had built a full episode around a presidential race, following Douche and Turd 4 years earlier. But this time the writers took a much bigger risk, since they had to commit to a script and a story before knowing for certain which candidate, Barack Obama or John McCain, would actually win. The speed behind this episode deserves close attention attention on its own, since it says a lot about how differently South Park operates compared to almost every other television show. Most animated programs need months to finish a single episode, moving through stages of writing, drawing, voice recording, and editing that simply cannot be rushed without sacrificing quality. South Park has always worked on a much faster schedule, often finishing an entire episode in less than a week using simpler production methods that let the team move quickly once a script gets finalized. Even with that speed, releasing a full episode about an election result within one day of the actual vote count required an enormous gamble. The team had to write and prepare most of the episode without knowing for certain how the real election would turn out, essentially betting on Obama winning and building the entire story around that outcome actually happening. This gamble becomes especially clear once looking at how directly the episode uses real material from that election night. The episode includes actual lines pulled from the victory and concession speeches both candidates delivered on the night of the election, speeches that took place only about 23 hours before the episode itself aired on television. Weaving real live footage and real speech content into an animated story finished this quickly shows just how tightly the production team had to work with real-time events, adjusting and finishing the episode in the narrow window between the actual election results coming in and the episode needing to be ready for broadcast the following night. The story opens by showing the reaction across South Park once the election results come in, splitting the town clearly along political lines. Randy and the other Obama supporters pour into the streets in a state of pure celebration, drinking heavily and behaving with the kind of unrestrained joy usually reserved for major sporting victories rather than a political election. On the other side of town, McCain supporters, including Ike, Kyle's younger brother, along with several school staff members and other residents, sit inside in a state of complete despair, treating the loss as something close to a personal tragedy, rather than simply the outcome of a normal democratic process. This divide, one half of town celebrating in the streets, while the other half sits inside in genuine grief, captures an exaggerated but recognizable version of how differently people can react to the same political event depending on which side they were rooting for. The show pushes this divide to an extreme that goes far beyond typical disappointment or celebration. Ike, still just a young child in the story, becomes so distraught over McCain's loss that he attempts to take his own life by jumping out of a window, an act clearly meant to shock through its sheer exaggeration rather than suggest anything realistic about how actual people behave after losing an election. He survives the fall but appears seriously hurt, and Stan and Kyle spend a significant portion of the episode trying to get him medical help. Their efforts run into trouble almost immediately since the hospital ends up short-staffed at the worst possible moment. One doctor, an Obama supporter, has abandoned his post to join the street celebrations, while another doctor, a McCain supporter, has taken his own life over the election loss, leaving the hospital critically understaffed right when Ike needs urgent care. Meanwhile, Cartman takes full advantage of the citywide chaos for his own benefit, moving through town stealing televisions from homes and businesses distracted by the celebrations and despair consuming everyone else. This detail adds a layer of pure self-interest into a story otherwise focused on extreme political emotion, showing one character treating a moment of national significance as nothing more than an opportunity for personal gain, unmoved by either the celebration or the grief surrounding him. Randy also contributes to the chaos in his own way, believing that Obama's victory somehow means normal consequences no longer apply to his own behavior, leading him to punch his boss in the face during the drunken celebrations, an act that lands him in trouble despite his boss sharing similar political views. Officer Barbrady, trying to restore order once the celebrations spiral out of control, gets mistaken for a political opponent by the drunken crowd simply because he is attempting to calm things down, leading to his own patrol car getting flipped over by people who assume anyone trying to stop the party must be against them politically. On the opposing side of town, the Stotch family, deeply shaken by McCain's loss, begins building a large survival shelter, treating the election result as though it signals some kind of coming disaster serious enough to require hiding away from the outside world. Numerous other frightened conservative residents try to join this shelter, leading to conflict over limited space and eventually a physical fight breaking out among people desperate to find safety from a political outcome that, in reality, changes very little about their immediate daily lives. This exaggerated reaction mirrors, in an extreme form, a real pattern that shows up after many contested or emotional elections, where some individuals treat a political loss as an existential threat rather than simply a disappointing result within a normal democratic process. All of this chaos across South Park runs alongside the episode's real twist, one that reframes the entire election in a completely unexpected way. In a private meeting, Obama and McCain reveal to each other that their competing campaigns were never a genuine political rivalry at all. Instead, both men are secretly members of an elite team of professional thieves, and their entire years-long campaign for president was actually a carefully planned setup, engineered specifically so that whichever one of them won the election would gain access to a secret escape tunnel running from the Oval Office directly toward the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of Natural History. Their real target the entire time was never the presidency itself, but rather the Hope Diamond, a genuine famous gem actually housed at the Smithsonian in real life, which the team plans to steal using this hidden tunnel once one of them officially takes office. This reveal turns the entire episode into a parody structured like a heist movie, complete with a full team assembled specifically for this operation. Sarah Palin, McCain's actual running mate in the real 2008 election, is shown as part of this same criminal team, playing a role built around misdirection and charm within the group's plan. Michelle Obama is revealed to have only ever pretended to be Obama's spouse for the cameras, actually serving as the team's technical expert, handling the more complicated parts of the operation. Ike, despite his earlier suicide attempt shown to the rest of the town, turns out to have secretly been part of the heist crew from the very beginning, using his role at the hospital to swap medical records and help fake the deaths of the entire team once their heist wraps up. The heist plays out with a real Smithsonian building serving as its setting, since Obama and Michelle break into the actual museum, moving through a room protected with laser security systems in a scene styled directly after famous heist films built around elaborate security bypass sequences. Once the diamond is successfully stolen, Ike destroys a private plane loaded with fake bodies meant to represent the entire team, creating a cover story that convinces the wider world the group has died, buying them the freedom to disappear completely once the theft is finished. The episode's final turn comes the next morning, once the heist has been successfully completed and the team is preparing to leave the country for good with their stolen diamond. Rather than joining them, Obama makes a surprising decision to stay behind instead, choosing to actually take on the responsibilities of being president rather than disappearing along with the rest of his crew. He convinces Michelle to remain behind with him as well, deciding together to give the actual job of leading the country a genuine attempt, rather than treating the whole election as nothing more than an elaborate cover story, now that its original purpose has already been achieved. This ending gives the episode an unusual final note compared to most of the show's political stories. Rather than closing on pure cynicism, treating the presidency itself as nothing but a hollow prize connected to an elaborate scam, the episode lets its version of Obama choose at the very last moment to take the actual responsibility of the office seriously, walking away from an easy escape with a stolen fortune in favor of staying and doing the job the country just elected him to do. This choice adds a small note of sincerity buried underneath an otherwise absurd, over-the-top premise built around jewel theft and faked deaths, suggesting that even inside a joke this ridiculous, the show found room to end on something resembling genuine hope about the incoming administration, rather than pure mockery aimed at the political process itself. Critics who reviewed the episode after it aired noted how the show managed to strike a balance many people found surprising, given how divisive the actual election had been across the country in the weeks leading up to voting day. One reviewer highlighted how impressed he was that the creators took the gamble of assuming Obama would win, then wove real lines from his actual victory speech directly into a completely fictional heist story, using genuine footage to add unexpected weight to an otherwise ridiculous plot about stolen jewels and faked identities. Another review focused specifically on how well the episode captured the real-time cultural mood of that particular week, noting how the mix of scripted material and unscripted lines pulled from real speeches made the show feel unusually connected to the exact moment it was released, rather than feeling like commentary on an event that had already faded from public attention. Parker himself later described the approach taken toward the episode as an attempt to stay out of picking sides in the political rivalry itself as much as possible, treating both candidates as part of the same joke, rather than favoring one side of the actual election over the other. Looking back at this episode, next to the show's earlier attempt at covering a presidential race in Douche and Turd, a clear difference stands out in how each one chooses to end. Douche and Turd closed with an entire election rendered meaningless by unrelated news that erased the whole process. About Last Night takes its own absurd premise, a presidential race secretly functioning as a plan for jewel theft, and still finds a way to end with a character choosing responsibility and genuine effort over an easy escape with stolen riches. Both episodes use exaggeration and total absurdity as their primary tools, but they land in very different emotional places by the time each one one reaches its final scene. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves away from a real election result entirely and looks instead at how the show handled a much darker and more suspicious topic just 2 years later, when Cartman becomes convinced that the events of September 11th were secretly the work of the government itself. Section 6. Cartman, Bush, and the 9/11 Conspiracy. Mystery of the Urinal Deuce. South Park took on one of the most sensitive topics in modern American history, using a story that starts with something as small and silly as a bathroom mess. The episode is called Mystery of the Urinal Deuce, and it aired on October 11th, 2006 as the 9th episode of the show's 10th season, the 148th episode of the series overall. Trey Parker wrote and directed it, continuing a pattern of using absurd, small-scale setups to explore much larger and more serious ideas. This time turning his attention toward the conspiracy theories that had grown around the September 11th terrorist attacks in the years following that event. The story begins inside a normal school day at South Park Elementary, when Mr. Mackey storms into class, furious that someone has left a mess in one of the boys' bathroom urinals. Mr. Mackey treats this incident with an intensity that feels far beyond what the situation actually calls for, speaking about it using a series of awkward, exaggerated phrases that make the other kids laugh rather than take the matter seriously. This overreaction from a school counselor towards something so minor sets the tone for the entire episode, establishing early on that adults in this story are prone to treating small, unimportant problems with the same seriousness usually reserved for major crises. Cartman is the character who first draws a connection between this bathroom incident and the September 11th attacks, comparing the mystery of who left the mess in the urinal to the larger conspiracy theories already circulating at the time about who was truly responsible for the terrorist attacks years earlier. Cartman brings up a real statistic in his argument, claiming that 1 in every 4 Americans believed the September 11th attacks were secretly planned by people other than the attackers publicly blamed for it, a figure meant to represent how widespread these kinds of theories had become by the time this episode aired. Stan and Kyle immediately dismiss Cartman's comparison, refusing to take his theory seriously and mocking anyone who holds similar beliefs about the attacks. Rather than dropping the subject, Cartman becomes increasingly determined to prove his theory correct. He goes home and spends time researching the September 11th attacks on his own, eventually returning to school with a full presentation built around numbers and patterns he believes point toward a hidden truth. During a class presentation, he lays out his case using what he claims is solid evidence, though his findings ultimately land on an absurd and completely unfounded conclusion, accusing Kyle himself of secretly being behind the attacks. Cartman bases this accusation on a flimsy connection involving a grade Kyle received on a spelling test roughly 12 days after the actual attacks took place, treating this coincidence as though it were meaningful proof rather than a completely random detail with no real connection to anything. This accusation spreads quickly through the school, and soon many of Kyle's classmates begin treating him with suspicion, avoiding him and believing Cartman's baseless theory simply because it was presented with enough confidence and structure to seem convincing on the surface. This part of the story captures something true about how conspiracy theories often spread in real life, showing how a confident presentation built around numbers and patterns can convince people of something completely false, especially when the audience is not equipped or willing to carefully examine the actual logic being presented. Cartman never needs real evidence to convince his classmates. He only needs enough structure and confidence in his delivery to make his claims feel credible, regardless of how little they actually hold up under scrutiny. Meanwhile, the investigation into the bathroom incident continues moving forward on its own separate track. When local police fail to make any real progress solving the mystery of the urinal, they eventually bring in outside help, hiring a parody detective duo modeled after a classic series of mystery novels featuring 2 young amateur investigators known for solving strange local cases. This subplot runs alongside the growing chaos caused by Cartman's accusation against Kyle, giving the episode 2 separate mysteries unfolding at the same time, one focused on a minor bathroom incident and the other focused on the far more serious accusation tied to a national tragedy. As pressure builds around Kyle, following an accusation nobody can actually prove but many people have started to believe anyway, Kyle's mother eventually calls a town meeting to address the growing suspicion surrounding her son. This meeting reflects how quickly a baseless rumor, once repeated enough times and treated as credible by enough people, can force an entire community into taking action, even when there was never any real evidence behind the original claim in the first place. Stan and Kyle, determined to clear Kyle's name and get to the bottom of what is actually true, decide to investigate the September 11th conspiracy theories themselves, rather than simply waiting for the rumor to fade on its own. Their investigation eventually leads them into contact with a real-world figure connected to the actual conspiracy theory movement surrounding the attacks, a man associated with an organization dedicated to promoting the belief that the government was secretly responsible for what happened. This character represents the real community of people who genuinely believed in the years following the actual attacks that the official explanation given by the government was false, and that some hidden, more sinister truth was being covered up. Stan and Kyle's search eventually leads them all the way to the White House itself, where they come face to face with President George W. Bush and members of his administration, hoping to finally get a straight answer about what actually happened on September 11th, and why so many people had come to believe the government was somehow involved. The explanation Bush and his staff eventually provide takes the episode in an unexpected direction. Rather than confirming that the government was secretly behind the attacks, Bush explains that the real value of these conspiracy theories, from the government's own point of view, comes from how they make ordinary citizens believe the government holds far more power and control than it actually does. By allowing these theories to spread rather than working hard to shut them down, the government benefits from citizens believing it is powerful and dangerous enough to have secretly orchestrated something as massive as the September 11th attacks, even though the actual attacks were carried out by extremists entirely separate from the American government itself. This explanation flips the entire premise of the episode. Rather than confirming the conspiracy theory Cartman had been chasing throughout the episode, the show instead exposes something arguably more unsettling: the idea that a government might have genuine incentive to quietly let dangerous, false theories about its own power spread unchecked, simply because those theories make the public more fearful and more willing to believe in the government's overwhelming reach. This twist lets the episode make a sharper and more complicated point than a straightforward story confirming or denying any single conspiracy theory could have managed on its own. Rather than simply mocking people who believe in conspiracy theories, or alternatively validating those same theories by having the government actually confess to secretly planning the attacks, the show finds a middle position that critiques something different entirely: the idea that power itself can benefit from mystery and fear, regardless of whether the specific theories floating around happen to be true. This approach avoids taking a simple side on one of the most emotionally charged and politically sensitive topics of the era, instead aiming its criticism at a more abstract idea about how governments and powerful institutions can benefit from public confusion and fear, even without directly causing the tragic events those fears are built around. While all of this plays out on a national scale involving the president himself, the smaller mystery involving the bathroom urinal finally reaches its own resolution as well, tying directly back into the episode's larger theme. It turns out that Stan himself was the one responsible for the original incident that kicked off the entire episode, having used the urinal out of simple necessity because every other stall happened to be full at the time, and he did not want to miss recess by waiting any longer. Rather than admitting to something this small and understandable, Stan chose instead to let people believe some larger, mysterious explanation was behind it, and the wider town, much like the government in the September 11th storyline, found it easier and somehow more satisfying to accept a vague, unclear explanation rather than the simple, unglamorous truth sitting right in front of them the entire time. This parallel between the two separate mysteries running through the episode, one about a national tragedy and one about a minor school bathroom incident, gives the whole story its real structure and its sharpest point. Both mysteries end the same way, with the actual, simple explanation being far less interesting than the elaborate theories people constructed around them. And both situations show how comfortable people can become accepting confusion, blame, and speculation rather than a plain, ordinary truth. The show uses the small, silly bathroom mystery as a kind of mirror held up against the much heavier and more serious mystery surrounding September 11th, suggesting that human beings often prefer a dramatic, mysterious story over a boring, simple one, regardless of whether the situation involves something as trivial as a school bathroom or as significant as a national tragedy. The episode does take some risk in how directly it engages with September 11th as subject matter, given how emotionally raw the actual event remained for much of the American public even 5 years after it happened. Rather than avoiding the topic entirely or treating it with total seriousness throughout, the show wraps its commentary inside an absurd, almost silly structure, using a children's mystery format and a bathroom prank as its framing device. This choice lets the episode explore a genuinely uncomfortable subject, why people believe elaborate conspiracy theories and what governments might gain from letting those theories spread, without needing to directly recreate or dramatize the actual tragic events of that day in any serious or graphic way. Cartman's own role throughout the episode also deserves attention, since his character ends up serving two separate purposes within the larger story. On one level, he represents the kind of confident, aggressive conspiracy theorist willing to build an entire accusation against an innocent person using nothing more than flimsy coincidence dressed up as solid proof. On another level, despite being completely wrong about who is actually behind September 11th, his instinct that something larger and more complicated than the simple official story might be happening ends up being partially validated once Bush's explanation reveals the government's actual interest in letting conspiracy theories continue circulating. Cartman never learns the full truth behind Bush's explanation, and his specific accusation against Kyle remains just as baseless and wrong as it always was. But the episode leaves open a strange kind of half-validation for the general suspicion that official explanations do not always tell the complete story, even while thoroughly mocking the specific way Cartman chose to pursue that suspicion. Looking at Mystery of the Urinal Deuce next to the other episodes covered so far, this one stands out for tackling a topic far more emotionally sensitive than school elections, immigrant labor, or even a secretive religious organization. September 11th remained, and still remains, one of the most painful and significant events in modern American history, and building an entire comedic episode around conspiracy theories tied to that event required a careful balance most other topics would not have demanded in quite the same way. The show managed this balance by keeping its actual criticism aimed at something abstract, the relationship between power and public fear, rather than making any specific claim about what truly happened on that day, letting its silliest subplot, a bathroom mess blamed on mysterious forces, carry the real weight of its argument instead. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section shifts to a completely different kind of tragedy, one the show revisited using an entire season rather than a single episode, when South Park turned its attention towards school shootings and the numb, repeated way American communities have learned to respond to them. Section 7, School Shootings as Background Noise, Dead Kids, 2018. South Park opened its 22nd season with an episode that took direct aim at one of the most painful and repeated headlines in modern American life, using an entire family's home life to show how normal something horrifying had become. The episode is called Dead Kids, and it aired on September 26, 2018, as the first episode of the show's 22nd season. Rather than focusing on a single event or a single character's reaction, the episode builds its entire story around how quickly people can adjust to repeated tragedy, using the Marsh family as the main lens through which this idea gets explored. The episode opens inside a normal classroom at South Park Elementary. Mrs. Nelson is handing back the results of a recent math test, going over questions the students answered incorrectly so everyone can understand where they went wrong. Cartman is annoyed because he failed the test despite copying answers from Tolkien, a classmate who actually passed. Partway through this ordinary classroom scene, a shooting begins just outside the room. Rather than reacting with fear or panic, the class continues on exactly as before, still discussing the math test even as gunfire and chaos unfold nearby. A member of a SWAT team eventually enters the classroom in the middle of all this, and the students barely acknowledge his presence, treating the entire event with a kind of numb familiarity that suggests this is far from the first time something like this has happened at their school. This opening sets the tone for the entire episode, establishing a world where school shootings have become so frequent and so expected that they no longer disrupt daily routines in any meaningful way. The show does not treat this as the first shooting these characters have ever experienced. Instead, everything about how the students, teachers, and staff respond suggests this is simply one more entry in a long, ongoing pattern they have already grown used to, continuing lessons and conversations as though a violent event happening feet away barely registers as an interruption worth stopping for. Sharon Marsh becomes the one clear exception to this widespread numbness. Once the shooting ends and Stan emerges from the school, Sharon rushes past the police tape holding back other parents and grabs her son, overwhelmed with relief and emotion at finding him alive. This reaction stands in sharp contrast to how everyone around her behaves, including Stan and his friends who seem confused by how upset she is over an event they treat as fairly routine. Cartman, watching this reaction unfold, wonders aloud what could possibly be wrong with Stan's mother, treating her visible distress as the unusual behavior rather than recognizing that her reaction is actually the only one that makes sense given what just happened. Once the family returns home, Sharon asks Stan to tell his father, Randy, about what happened at school that day. Stan initially eventually assumes she means his failing math grade, mentioning that detail first before Sharon prompts him to bring up the actual shooting instead. Randy's response to hearing about the shooting focuses almost entirely on whether Stan was personally involved or hurt, asking directly if Stan was the shooter or if he had been shot himself. Once Stan answers no to both questions, Randy immediately shifts his attention back toward the math test, treating the shooting itself as a settled, unremarkable matter now that his son is confirmed to be safe and uninvolved. This exchange captures the episode's central argument with unusual clarity. Randy is not written as a cruel or uncaring father in any obvious way. He clearly loves his son and wants to make sure he is safe, but his complete lack of concern about the shooting itself, once he confirms Stan was not directly harmed, shows just how thoroughly this kind of violence has been normalized within the world of the show. A school shooting occurring nearby has become, for Randy and seemingly most other adults in town, simply background information, worth checking on only to the extent it might have personally affected his own child, rather than something requiring any broader concern, anger, or grief on its own. Sharon's frustration with this reaction builds throughout the rest of the episode. She becomes increasingly upset that nobody else around her seems willing to treat these shootings as the serious, alarming events she believes they should be. When she raises her concerns to Randy directly, he responds by suggesting her strong emotional reaction might be connected to her menstrual cycle, treating her legitimate distress over ongoing school violence as a hormonal issue rather than a reasonable response to a genuinely disturbing pattern of events happening around their own community. This response from Randy becomes a recurring theme throughout the episode, with him repeatedly dismissing Sharon's concerns by attributing them to her body rather than engaging honestly with the actual substance of what she is upset about. As more shootings occur throughout the episode, each one treated with the same casual indifference by nearly everyone except Sharon, she eventually tries to organize other parents into taking some kind of collective action. She invites a group of parents over specifically to discuss the ongoing shootings and figure out what might be done to address the situation. Rather than sharing her concern or working with her toward any kind of solution, the other parents largely brush off her worries, treating the whole subject as too complicated or too exhausting to seriously engage with, preferring instead to move on from the conversation as quickly as possible. This scene mirrors real frustrations many people have expressed about how conversations around gun violence and school shootings often unfold, with genuine concern frequently met by exhaustion, deflection, or a sense that the problem is simply too large and too complicated for any individual or small group to meaningfully address. Randy's dismissiveness toward Sharon reaches a particularly pointed moment when Steven Stotch, another parent, suggests directly to Randy that Sharon's reaction might not be about her period at all, but rather something more serious, possibly menopause instead. Randy takes this suggestion seriously enough that he actually visits a school that recently experienced its own shooting, specifically to ask a doctor there about what menopause actually involves. The doctor explains the basic details of menopause to Randy, information that leaves him visibly shaken once he realizes how long this condition can last. This entire sequence, built around Randy investigating a medical explanation for his wife's behavior, rather than simply listening to her actual words about the shootings themselves, reinforces just how far Randy is willing to go to avoid confronting the real subject Sharon keeps trying to raise with him. Randy eventually attempts to smooth things over with Sharon by throwing a small party in her honor, singing to her in front of their neighbors as a gesture meant to show affection and support. Sharon, however, becomes angry rather than touched by this display, since the gesture still fails to address her actual concerns, and she once again insists to Randy and their neighbors that she is not going through menopause, growing increasingly frustrated that everyone around her keeps searching for a medical explanation for her feelings, rather than acknowledging the actual ongoing violence she has been trying to draw attention to the entire time. The episode's turning point comes when Sharon, worn down by weeks of being dismissed and having her concerns explained away, finally begins to accept the idea that her strong reactions might have been at least partly driven by hormonal changes after all. She apologizes to Randy, admitting she may have been overly emotional throughout everything that happened. Randy, relieved and touched by this apology, reacts with genuine joy and gratitude, embracing the moment as a resolution to the tension that has defined their relationship throughout the episode. This apology arrives just just as Sharon receives a phone call informing her that yet another shooting has occurred, this time at Stan's school, with news that her own son has been shot during the incident. Rather than reacting with the same panic and urgency she displayed earlier in the episode when Stan was simply present at a shooting without being harmed, Sharon responds to this news with a calm, subdued reaction, mirroring the same numb indifference Randy and everyone else in town has displayed from the very beginning of the episode. Randy, seeing his wife finally react the way he and everyone around them always has, embraces her warmly, treating her newfound calmness as a positive, welcome change rather than recognizing it as something deeply troubling. The episode ends on this note, with Sharon fully absorbed into the same desensitized mindset she had spent the entire episode fighting against, suggesting that even the one character who maintained genuine alarm about ongoing school violence eventually gets worn down into accepting it as normal, just like everyone else around her. This ending gives the episode a distinctly bitter, unresolved feeling compared to some of the other political stories covered earlier in this series. Rather than offering any kind of solution or hopeful resolution, the show closes by showing its one voice of genuine concern finally giving up and adopting the same numbness surrounding her, suggesting that this kind of desensitization is not simply an individual failing, but rather something that spreads and eventually consumes anyone forced to live inside a pattern of repeated, ongoing violence for long enough. Sharon does not change the world around her over the course of the episode. Instead, the world around her eventually changes her, wearing down her resistance until she reacts to her own son being shot with the same detached calm everyone else in town has shown from the very start. Running alongside this main storyline, the episode includes a separate plot involving Cartman and his ongoing frustration with a classmate named Tolkien, whose family is black. Cartman becomes convinced that Tolkien deliberately gave him wrong answers to copy during the math test out of spite, and he spends much of the episode trying to dig up information that might embarrass or expose Tolkien in some way. This subplot touches on Cartman's long-running pattern of casual prejudice, including a moment where he expresses disbelief that Tolkien had not seen a major film centered around black culture and characters, assuming incorrectly that every black person would have automatically seen and cared about that particular movie simply because of their race. This subplot runs at a much smaller, more personal scale compared to the school shooting storyline, giving the episode a secondary target focused on casual, everyday prejudice rather than large-scale national tragedy, though it never receives quite the same depth of attention as the main story involving Sharon and Randy. Critics who reviewed the episode after its release generally praised how directly it tackled the subject of school shooting fatigue, a real and recognized pattern where repeated exposure to tragic news events can gradually numb public reaction over time, even when the underlying events remain just as serious and devastating as ever. Some reviewers noted that the episode occasionally repeated the same basic beat, adults dismissing Sharon's concerns in slightly different ways, several times throughout its runtime without significantly building or expanding on the idea beyond its initial setup. Even with this repetition, most reviews recognize the episode as a sharp, uncomfortable commentary on a genuinely difficult subject, one that many other television shows have avoided addressing directly, given how emotionally sensitive and politically charged the topic of school shootings remains in American life. The episode's ratings when it first aired came in notably lower than the previous season's premiere, marking the lowest rated season premiere in the show's history up to that point. Whether this lower viewership had anything to do with the difficult subject matter, general shifts in how audiences were watching television at the time, or some other unrelated factor remains unclear, though the timing does suggest that tackling such a heavy, painful topic as the focus of an entire season premiere may have affected how many people tuned in compared to previous years. What makes Dead Kids stand apart from many of the show's earlier political episodes is how it avoids assigning blame to any single cause, policy, or political position connected to gun violence in America. The episode never mentions specific laws, political parties, or policy proposals related to guns at all. Instead, it aims its entire argument at something more abstract and, in some ways, more unsettling: the human capacity to grow numb to repeated tragedy simply through sheer repetition and exposure. By keeping its focus on this psychological and emotional pattern rather than any specific political debate, the episode manages to comment on a deeply political and painful subject without directly weighing in on the kinds of policy arguments that usually dominate public conversations about this issue. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves from gun violence inside American schools to a different kind of fear altogether, when the show turned its attention toward immigration enforcement and border policy by blending it with the anxious cultural conversation surrounding a controversial comic book villain movie. Section 8. ICE, The Border, and the Mexican Joker, 2019. South Park opened its 23rd season by mixing two very different sources of public anxiety into a single story, blending real concerns about immigration enforcement with the cultural panic surrounding a controversial comic book movie released that same year. The episode is called Mexican Joker, and it aired on September 25th, 2019, as the first episode of the show's 23rd season, the 298th episode of the series overall. Trey Parker wrote and directed it, aiming this particular episode at the treatment of immigrant families and children inside detention centers run by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, an agency commonly known by its initials, ICE, which had become a major focus of national news coverage and public debate in the years leading up to this episode's release. The story opens away from the main political subject entirely, focused instead on Randy Marsh and his marijuana growing business, known within the show as Tegrity Farms. Randy leads a group of tourists on a walk through his farm, showing off how the business has grown and expanded since its earlier days. Cartman, tagging along, complains to Stan about changes he has noticed at the farm, while Randy admits that his customer orders have started dropping. This decline, it turns out, comes from more and more local residents choosing to grow their own marijuana at home rather than continuing to buy from Randy's business, cutting into his sales and frustrating him considerably as the episode continues. While this business plot develops in the background, the episode's real focus shifts toward Cartman and Kyle. Cartman, driven by his usual mix of spite and mischief, decides to report Kyle and his family to ICE, falsely suggesting they might be living in the country illegally. This accusation triggers immediate and serious consequences. ICE agents arrive at the Broflovsky home and force their way inside, pulling Kyle's family apart in a scene the show plays with unusual seriousness compared to its typical style of exaggerated humor. Kyle's younger brother, adopted from Canada, cries out for his mother as the family gets separated by the agents carrying out the raid. A moment presented with a level of genuine emotional weight rarely seen in episodes built around this kind of political subject matter. Kyle's father is unable to immediately locate the family's passports during the raid, a detail that further complicates the situation and leads to the family being taken into custody despite having no actual connection to illegal immigration. Kyle himself ends up separated from his parents and placed into a detention center specifically holding children, joining a group of other kids who appear to be almost entirely of Mexican background, aside from Kyle standing out as the clear exception among them. This detention center is run by a guard named Jeff Corrigan, along with another staff member serving quite badly as a Spanish language translator for the children being held there. Corrigan greets the newly arrived children by acknowledging that they have been separated from their families, while still trying to reassure them that plenty of enjoyable activities await them inside the facility, a claim that stands in obvious, uncomfortable contrast to the grim, prison-like conditions the children are actually shown living in once they arrive. Once inside the facility, the children are handed sheets of aluminum foil, apparently meant to serve as makeshift blankets, and led into a fenced-off area containing rows of sleeping bags laid out across the floor. This detail, along with the broader depiction of children being separated from their parents and held in cramped, impersonal conditions, closely mirrors real reporting that had circulated widely in American news coverage in the years before this episode aired, describing similar conditions inside actual immigration detention facilities operated under a policy that led to widespread public concern and criticism at the time. Kyle, trying to find some way to draw attention to the injustice of what is happening to him and the other children, comes up with an unusual plan once he realizes something important about how the ICE agents are reacting to his own background. Kyle is Jewish, and once this detail becomes known to the agents running the facility, they react with obvious discomfort, worried about how it might look for their operation to be holding a Jewish child in detention alongside everyone else, given how badly that detail could damage the agency's public image if it became widely known. Recognizing this reaction, Kyle decides to use his own religious identity as a tool to try freeing all of the children held alongside him. He has every child in the facility fashion the aluminum foil sheets they were given into small skull caps traditionally worn by Jewish individuals, attempting to make it appear as though the entire group of detained children shares his same religious background, hoping this will pressure the agents into releasing everyone rather than risk the appearance of holding an entire group of Jewish children in custody. This plan runs into an unexpected complication once Corrigan, the lead guard at the facility, sees the children wearing these makeshift head coverings and experiences a sudden flashback, mistakenly believing he is witnessing the origin of a violent, dangerous figure the show refers to throughout the episode as the Mexican Joker. This name draws a direct connection to a real film released that same year, a movie centered around a troubled, isolated man who transforms into a violent supervillain after enduring years of social neglect and mistreatment. The episode uses this fictional villain concept as a warning throughout its story, suggesting repeatedly that treating children this poorly, separating them from their families, and holding them in harsh, dehumanizing conditions risks creating exactly the kind of resentful, dangerous figure this fictional villain represents, rather than achieving whatever security goals the detention system claims to serve. Kyle directly explains this warning to the ICE agents overseeing the facility, describing the concept of a Mexican Joker as a way of illustrating what can happen when a person experiences years of cruelty and rejection from a system meant to protect them. Rather than understanding this warning as a broader point about how mistreatment can create lasting anger and resentment, the agents in the story take Kyle's comparison far too literally, becoming convinced that an actual, specific individual matching this description exists and poses a real, immediate threat. This misunderstanding drives much of the episode's plot forward, as the agents grow increasingly paranoid about the supposed Mexican Joker figure, entirely missing the larger point Kyle was actually trying to make about the consequences of the system they themselves are running. Cartman eventually ends up joining Kyle inside the same detention facility, sent there as a form of payback orchestrated by Stan in response to Cartman's original decision to report Kyle's family to ICE in the first place. Once inside, Cartman shows little concern about his own situation, seemingly confident that his background protects him from facing any serious consequences within the facility. Rather than showing distress, he instead starts singing songs from a well-known musical about an orphan girl, using the tunes in an attempt to comfort the frightened children being held alongside him. A moment that blends dark humor with a genuine, if strange, attempt at kindness from a character usually associated with cruelty rather than compassion. Meanwhile, back in South Park, Randy's frustration over his declining marijuana sales escalates dramatically. Rather than continuing to compete fairly with local residents growing their own marijuana at home, Randy resorts to outright destruction, causing a series of explosions throughout town that destroy all of the privately grown marijuana fields belonging to his competitors. Local police immediately suspect the fictional Mexican Joker figure of causing these explosions, mistakenly connecting Randy's real acts of sabotage to the imagined threat the ICE agents have become fixated on throughout the episode. This mistaken connection allows Randy to escape any real consequences for his actions, since suspicion falls entirely on a fictional villain rather than the actual person responsible for the destruction. Back inside the detention facility, the story takes a darker turn once it becomes clear that Corrigan and the other guards have been deliberately mistreating the children in ways specifically designed to prevent them from ever becoming a real version of the Mexican Joker figure they fear so much. This mistreatment, ironically, mirrors the exact kind of trauma the fictional villain concept was originally meant to warn against, showing the guards inflicting harm on children specifically because they misunderstood Kyle's warning as describing an actual threat requiring aggressive, preventative punishment, rather than recognizing it as a caution against the very kind of cruelty they were already engaged in. This misunderstanding leads to further violence within the facility, eventually resulting in one of the guards turning against his fellow staff members, killing several of them after realizing the harm they had all been causing to the children under their supervision. This same guard eventually frees all of the detained children, motivated by a hope that doing so might spare his own life, if the Mexican Joker figure he still believes to be real turns out to actually exist and comes looking for revenge. This moment folds the episode's darkest material back into its central point about consequences, showing a character taking drastic, violent action based entirely on a misunderstanding created by the very system he had been enforcing, one built around fear and mistreatment rather than any genuine effort to protect or care for the children caught inside it. The episode ends on a cliffhanger, with Kyle and Cartman still shown trapped inside the detention facility as the story closes, leaving their fate unresolved by the time the credits roll. Randy, meanwhile, faces no consequences at all for his own destructive actions, having successfully avoided blame by letting suspicion fall entirely on the fictional villain figure invented earlier in the episode. This unresolved ending gives the story an unusually bleak note to close on, especially compared to some of the other episodes covered earlier in this series, leaving open questions about the fate of the detained children rather than offering any clear resolution within the episode itself. The following episode in the season 7 eventually resolves this cliffhanger, revealing that the plan to free the detained children succeeded, with Kyle and Cartman shown returning home on a bus provided by ICE once the situation at the facility was finally resolved. This resolution comes in a later episode rather than within Mexican Joker itself, meaning the initial episode alone ends without providing viewers any immediate reassurance about how its darkest plotline actually turns out. What makes this episode stand apart from many of the show's earlier political stories is how directly and seriously it engages with real, documented conditions inside actual immigration detention facilities, rather than relying purely on exaggeration or fictional invention to make its point. The depiction of family separation, children held in fenced areas with only aluminum sheets for warmth, and confusion among staff about how to handle unexpected details like a child's religious background, all drew directly from real news reporting that had already reached a wide audience by the time this episode aired. Rather than needing to invent an exaggerated fictional scenario to critique this policy, the show largely presented a heightened but recognizable version of conditions that had already been reported as factual by numerous news organizations covering the treatment of detained immigrant families and children during this period. The choice to focus specifically on Kyle, a character never associated with any actual immigration status concerns prior to this episode, being wrongly swept into this system due to nothing more than Cartman's baseless accusation, allowed the show to explore how quickly and arbitrarily this kind of enforcement could catch up innocent people who had no real connection to the actual policy concerns driving it in the first place. By placing one of its own long-running familiar characters directly inside this system, the episode forced its usual younger audience members and longtime viewers to confront the human consequences of a policy that, for many people watching from a comfortable distance, may have otherwise remained an abstract news story rather than something involving characters they had already grown attached to across many previous seasons. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves away from a specific policy debate entirely and looks instead at how the show approached its most direct and controversial political target yet, when its 27th season opened with an episode built almost entirely around a sitting president of the United States. Section 9, Sermon on the Mount, South Park versus a Sitting President, 2025. South Park returned after a long break from new episodes with a story built almost entirely around a sitting president of the United States, releasing one of the most talked about episodes in the show's entire history. The episode is called Sermon on the Mount, and it premiered on July 23, 2025, as the first episode of the show's 27th season, marking the 329th episode of the series overall, and the first traditional new episode released in more than 2 years. Trey Parker wrote and directed the episode, aiming its satire directly at the second presidency of Donald Trump, along with several specific real-world events connected to his administration during this period. The episode opens with Cartman waking up and asking his voice assistant device to play his favorite radio program, which turns out to be National Public Radio, a real American public broadcasting network. Cartman finds the program entertaining specifically because he enjoys listening to people he views as liberal complain about the lack of progressive values in modern society, treating their genuine frustration as a source of comedy, rather than something he takes seriously himself. His enjoyment gets interrupted when the broadcast suddenly turns to static, and his voice assistant explains that the president has canceled the network entirely. This detail connects directly to real funding cuts and political pressure aimed at public broadcasting that occurred during the actual Trump administration, giving the episode's opening moments a grounding in genuine, verifiable political events rather than pure invention. The main plot of the episode centers on Jesus Christ being brought directly into South Park Elementary as part of a legal agreement connected to the Trump administration's broader push to bring Christian religious teaching more directly into public schools. PC Principal, the school's authority figure, long associated throughout the show with progressive values and language, undergoes a notable shift in this episode, renaming himself to reflect this new religious focus at the school and welcoming Jesus into the building as part of an effort framed around protecting children from progressive cultural influences. This detail satirizes real political debates happening during this period around the role of religion in public education, and the legal pressure some schools face to accommodate religious content under the current administration. Randy Marsh becomes the character most directly opposed to this development, organizing resistance within the town against what he sees as an inappropriate and possibly illegal intrusion of religion into a public school setting. His frustration mirrors the reaction of numerous real parents and civil liberties organizations who raised similar objections to actual policy changes connected to religion in public education, occurring around this same time. Meanwhile, Cartman experiences his own personal crisis throughout the episode, becoming convinced that progressive cultural values have effectively disappeared from mainstream society, leaving him without a clear sense of purpose since so much of his usual behavior throughout the show's history has revolved around mocking or resisting those same values. The episode uses Randy's confusion and frustration to explore a broader satire of how ordinary people struggle to keep up with rapid legal and political changes during this period. At one point, Randy consults his own household voice assistant device late at night, hoping for some kind of clear guidance about whether bringing a religious figure into a public school is actually legal, only to receive a response that seems just as confused and uncertain about the situation as Randy himself, reflecting genuine public confusion during this period about how quickly the legal landscape around religion in schools was shifting under the current administration. As tensions rise throughout the episode, the story eventually brings Donald Trump himself directly into the plot, suing the entire town of South Park in response to the resistance being organized against the religious changes taking place at the school. This legal threat mirrors a real pattern that developed during Trump's second term, where the administration became known for using lawsuits and legal pressure as a tool against critics, journalists, and institutions perceived as standing in opposition to the administration's goals. The episode depicts this legal aggression in an exaggerated, absurd form, showing an entire town facing legal action simply for pushing back against a controversial policy decision at their local school. The episode includes several scenes depicting Trump in situations designed to mock and embarrass him personally, including scenes showing him in an intimate relationship with a devil character the show has used before to represent past controversial world leaders. This creative choice draws a direct parallel to earlier moments in the show's history, since the same devil character had previously been used in a similar way to depict a past real-world dictator during an earlier era of the show's run. By reusing this same character and the same basic joke structure against a sitting American president, the episode drew a pointed comparison between Trump and previous authoritarian figures the show had mocked using nearly identical material years earlier. Perhaps the most talked about single moment from the episode involves a segment depicting an artificially generated, altered version of Trump's likeness, shown nude and wandering through a desert landscape as part of a public service announcement style sequence within the episode. This particular moment generated enormous public conversation once the episode aired, with reactions split sharply between viewers who found it an example of fearless, boundary-pushing satire and viewers who considered it excessive, tasteless, or simply an unfair personal attack rather than legitimate political commentary. The episode's release carried significant weight beyond its actual content, largely because of timing connected to real business dealings involving the show's creators. Just 2 days before the episode premiered, Trey Parker and Matt Stone had finalized a major new deal with Paramount, guaranteeing streaming rights to the show's entire library, along with a commitment to produce new episodes over the following several years, an agreement reported to be worth roughly $1.5 billion. Releasing an episode this critical of Trump, along with pointed jokes aimed at Paramount itself, embedded directly into the episode's title through a play on words, connecting the word Paramount to the episode's biblical-sounding name, happened just days after this enormous financial agreement had been signed, creating a striking contrast between the show's continued willingness to criticize powerful institutions and the very corporate relationship that had just been renewed and expanded. This timing became even more notable given other events happening in the media industry around the same period. The episode aired during a stretch when Paramount had drawn criticism for settling a lawsuit brought by Trump against a separate CBS News program owned by the same parent company. And shortly after, a popular late-night television host known for criticizing Trump had seen his own show canceled, a decision some media commentators connected to broader corporate caution around criticizing the administration. Airing an episode this directly critical of Trump against this particular industry backdrop struck many media observers as an unusually bold move, given how many other media companies appeared to be treating criticism of the administration with increased caution during this same period. The episode also directly referenced real legal issues connected to the Trump administration during this period, including matters related to the Jeffrey Epstein files, a real and ongoing subject of public interest and controversy connected to Epstein's history of sex trafficking and his connections to numerous prominent public figures. By weaving this real sensitive subject into its satire, the episode continued its pattern of pulling directly from genuine current events rather than relying purely on invented scenarios, keeping its commentary tightly connected connected to matters that were actually dominating American news coverage at the time the episode aired. Public and critical reaction to the episode split along fairly predictable lines once it aired, though the overall response leaned heavily toward describing the episode as a significant, even historic moment for the show. Some commentary described the episode as one of the most openly defiant pieces of media released that year, specifically because of how directly it aimed criticism at both Trump and Paramount, within days of the show's creators signing such a lucrative deal with that same company. Other reactions focused more on the show's continued willingness to depict Trump using extreme, personally embarrassing imagery, questioning whether this approach represented sharp political satire or had crossed into something closer to personal mockery, disconnected from any specific policy critique. The White House issued its own public response to the episode following its release, reflecting the administration's direct awareness of and reaction to the show's content, a rare and notable occurrence given how few television episodes typically draw official comment from a sitting president's administration. This response added another layer of real-world significance to the episode, transforming it from simply another entry in the show's long history of political satire into a genuine moment of friction between a television program and the actual government it was mocking. Viewership numbers for the episode reached levels the show had not seen in decades, with reports indicating close to 6 million viewers across Paramount's streaming service and its cable broadcast within just the first few days of release. This made the episode's premiere the largest audience the show had drawn for a season opener in over 25 years, according to figures reported by Paramount itself following the release. The episode also reportedly generated an unusually large amount of conversation and discussion online compared to other television programming airing during that same period, reflecting just how significant a cultural moment this particular episode became upon its release. Looking at this episode within the larger pattern established across the previous episodes covered throughout this series, Sermon on the Mount represents a clear escalation in how directly the show chose to confront a sitting political leader compared to its earlier political stories. Douche and Turd criticized the structure of elections without ever depicting Bush or Kerry directly as characters within the story itself. About Last Night used real footage and quotes from Obama and McCain, but built its actual plot around a fictional heist rather than direct personal mockery of either man. This episode, by contrast, placed Trump himself directly into extended, deeply personal, and often crude scenarios, marking one of the most direct and aggressive approaches the show has ever taken toward a real, currently serving political leader. This escalation reflects in some ways a broader pattern that has developed across American political culture and media more generally during the years connecting Trump's first and second terms in office, with public discourse around him growing increasingly heated, personal, and polarized compared to earlier periods covered by prior episodes in this series. The show's willingness to match that same heightened intensity, using imagery and jokes far more explicit and personally aggressive than anything used against Bush, Kerry, Obama, or McCain in earlier episodes, mirrors this broader shift in how sharply and personally American political commentary has come to treat its most prominent and controversial figures. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section pulls back from any single episode entirely and looks instead at the full 20-year arc running from a small-town mascot election all the way to a lawsuit against an entire fictional town, tracing what has actually stayed consistent about the way this show has approached American politics across 5 different presidencies. Section 10. 20 Years of Douches and Turds. Why it still works. Looking back across everything covered so far, a clear pattern starts to take shape, one that stretches from a small-town mascot election in 2004 all the way to a president suing an entire fictional town in 2025. South Park has spent more than 2 decades returning again and again to American politics, and the episodes examined throughout this series show a show that has changed its targets constantly while staying remarkably consistent in how it actually approaches those targets. Understanding what stayed the same across 21 years and 5 different presidents says more about why this show has lasted as long as it has than any single episode could show on its own. The earliest episode covered here, Douche and Turd, aired just before the 2004 election and focused entirely on the structure of choosing between 2 candidates rather than picking apart either George W. Bush or John Kerry directly. Neither man ever appeared as a character in that episode. Instead, the show built an entirely fictional election around a giant douche and a turd sandwich, using 2 joke candidates to represent the feeling that real elections often boil down to choosing between 2 options nobody particularly respects. This choice to attack the system itself rather than the specific people running within it set a pattern the show would return to again and again throughout the years that followed. Even as its methods grew more direct and more willing to depict real politicians by name. The immigration episode covered next, Goobacks, took a completely different approach to a completely different subject just months earlier that same year, in April 2004. Rather than mocking a specific policy or political figure, the show built an elaborate science fiction premise around time-traveling workers from a poverty-stricken future, using this fantastical setup to explore genuine tension around low-wage labor competition without needing to attach the story to any real immigrant group or specific country. Randy's personal reversal in that episode, moving from lecturing his son about compassion toward becoming one of the loudest voices against the very workers he had just offended, showed the show's willingness to expose hypocrisy through a character's own actions rather than through direct narration explaining the point to viewers. Trapped in the Closet, released the following year in November 2005, marked a shift towards something more directly confrontational. Rather than inventing a fictional stand-in for a real institution, this episode named the Church of Scientology directly, laid out real details about its actual teachings and financial structure, and depicted two real famous actors, Tom Cruise and John Travolta, as characters within its story. The consequences that followed, including the departure of longtime cast member Isaac Hayes, and the unusual decision to credit the entire production team under fake names, showed just how seriously a target this powerful could respond once directly confronted on screen. This episode represents an important turning point in the pattern running through this whole series, since it demonstrates the show moving from broad institutional criticism toward direct, specific confrontation with real, identifiable figures and organizations. About Last Night, released just one day after the actual 2008 election results came in, pushed this pattern in yet another direction. Rather than avoiding the real candidates the way Douche and Turd had done, this episode built its entire plot directly around Barack Obama and John McCain, using real footage and real quotes pulled from their actual election night speeches. Yet even with this direct engagement, the episode chose an ending that offered something more hopeful than cynical, showing its version of Obama choosing genuine responsibility over an easy escape with stolen riches once the heist plot underlying the whole election reveals itself. This episode shows the show capable of engaging directly with real political figures, while still finding room for a surprisingly sincere conclusion. A different note compared to the harsher endings found in some of the show's other political stories. Mystery of the Urinal Deuce, airing in October 2006, tackled perhaps the most emotionally sensitive subject covered across this entire collection, building an episode around conspiracy theories connected to the September 11th attacks. Rather than confirming or denying any specific theory about what actually happened that day, the show aimed its sharpest criticism at something more abstract: the idea that governments might benefit from allowing dangerous, false theories about their own power to spread unchecked among the public. By pairing this heavy subject with a much smaller, sillier mystery involving a school bathroom, the episode found a way to explore genuinely uncomfortable territory without needing to directly depict or dramatize the actual tragic events themselves. Dead Kids, opening the show's 22nd season in September 2018, shifted the pattern once again, this time building an entire episode around emotional numbness rather than any specific policy debate. The episode never once mentioned specific gun laws or political positions on gun control. Instead, it built its entire argument around how quickly repeated tragedy can wear down even the most concerned individual, showing Sharon Marsh's genuine alarm about ongoing school shootings gradually collapsing into the same numb acceptance everyone around her had already adopted. This episode demonstrates the show's willingness to explore a deeply political and painful subject through purely emotional and psychological means, rather than through direct policy argument or specific blame assigned to any political position. Mexican Joker, opening the following season in September 2019, returned to a more direct and specific real-world policy target, building its story around actual documented conditions inside immigration detention facilities operated during this period. Unlike the fictional time-traveling immigrants shown in Goobacks 15 years earlier, this episode placed one of the show's own long-running characters, Kyle, directly inside a real-world system, using his personal experience to explore consequences that had already been reported as factual by numerous news organizations before this episode ever aired. The episode's willingness to depict family separation and child detention tension with unusual emotional seriousness, even while wrapping this heavy material inside its usual absurdist plotting, shows the show pushing its political commentary into territory far more grounded in verifiable current events than some of its earlier, more fantastical political stories. Sermon on the Mount, released in July 2025 after more than 2 years without new episodes, represents the furthest point along this entire pattern, marking the most direct and personally aggressive confrontation with a sitting political leader found anywhere across this entire collection. Where earlier episodes kept real politicians at arm's length, using fictional stand-ins or brief cameo appearances built around real footage, this episode placed Donald Trump directly at the center of an extended, deeply personal storyline, using imagery and jokes far more explicit and confrontational than anything the show had used against any previous president. The episode's willingness to simultaneously mock its own parent company Paramount, just days after its creators signed an enormous new deal with that same company, added a layer of genuine corporate risk that few of the earlier episodes covered in this series ever had to contend with in quite the same way. Looking across all 9 of these specific episodes together, a few consistent threads emerge clearly. The show has never limited itself to criticizing one particular political party or one particular political ideology. Douche and Turd mocked both the Republican and Democratic parties equally through its 2 joke candidates. Goobax refused to pick a clear side between immigrant workers and the local residents losing jobs to them. Dead Kids aimed its criticism at a shared, widespread numbness rather than at any specific political position on gun policy. This consistent refusal to settle into a single political lane helps explain why viewers holding very different political beliefs have all been able to find something in these episodes that resonates with their own frustrations, rather than feeling like the show speaks exclusively to one particular audience. Another consistent thread running through all of these episodes involves the show's willingness to expose hypocrisy through character action rather than direct narration. Randy's reversal in Goobax, moving from lecturing Stan about compassion to becoming one of the loudest voices against the very workers he had just defended, mirrors a similar dynamic found throughout many of these other episodes, where a character's own behavior, shown plainly on screen, does the work of exposing a contradiction rather than needing an explicit line of dialogue to spell out the point for viewers. This technique shows up again in Randy's dismissiveness toward Sharon in Dead Kids, in Cartman's casual cruelty throughout Mexican Joker, and even in the ICE agent's complete misreading of Kyle's warning in that same episode, mistaking a caution against cruelty for confirmation of an actual threat, requiring even more aggressive punishment. The show's willingness to blend real, documented facts with fictional or exaggerated elements also runs consistently throughout every episode examined in this series. Trapped in the Closet used a real journalist's research to ensure its depiction of Scientology's actual teachings remained accurate, even while wrapping that accurate information inside an absurd story about a locked closet and a reincarnated religious founder. Mexican Joker drew directly from real reported conditions inside actual detention facilities, even while building its larger plot around a fictional supervillain figure invented specifically for that episode. About Last Night wove real footage from an actual election night directly into a completely fictional heist story. This consistent blending of verified real-world material with invented absurdist plotting appears to be one of the show's most reliable techniques for tackling difficult subjects without losing its comedic identity entirely. The speed at which these episodes get produced also connects every single one of these stories together in a meaningful way. About Last Night aired within roughly 1 day of the actual election results being announced. Sermon on the Mount responded directly to ongoing current events connected to the Trump administration, including references to the Epstein files and Paramount's own recent business decisions, material that would have needed to be current right up until the episode's actual air date. This production speed, unusual for any animated series, has remained a defining feature of the show across its entire 27-season run, allowing Parker and Stone to comment on political events almost as quickly as those events actually happen, rather than waiting months for slower production schedules to catch up with the news. What has changed most clearly across this 21-year span, from Douche and Turd in 2004 to Sermon on the Mount in 2025, is the show's growing willingness to depict real political figures directly and personally, rather than keeping them at a comfortable distance through fictional stand-ins or brief cameo appearances. Bush and Kerry never appeared as actual characters in Douche and Turd. Obama and McCain appeared using real footage, but remained wrapped inside an entirely fictional heist plot in About Last Night. right. By the time Sermon on the Mount aired in 2025, Trump appeared directly and extensively throughout an entire episode, depicted in scenarios far more personal and confrontational than anything used against any earlier president covered in this series. This escalation mirrors a broader shift that has taken place across American political culture more generally during these same years, with public discourse growing increasingly personal, heated, and polarized compared to the environment surrounding the earlier episodes in this collection. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have described their own approach to satire over the years as treating every group and every political position as fair territory for a joke, refusing to protect any particular side from criticism regardless of their own personal views on any given issue. The episodes examined throughout this series reflect that stated approach consistently, even as the specific targets and specific methods used to reach those targets shifted considerably across 2 decades of American political life. From a joke election between a douche and a turd to a lawsuit filed by an actual sitting president against an entire fictional town, the show has managed something genuinely rare in television, staying current, staying provocative, and staying willing to mock whoever happens to be in power, regardless of which political party that person belongs to, across 5 different presidential administrations and more than 20 years of continuous production. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.